The wind howled like a wounded animal, tearing through the barren trees surrounding the Rusty Spoon, a dilapidated diner perched on the edge of a forgotten highway. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale grease and brewing coffee, a stark contrast to the biting frost that clawed at the windows. Layla, a beautiful African-American woman with eyes that held a sorrow far older than her years, tightened the strings of her long red apron. It was a splash of vibrant color against her crisp white shirt and sensible black skirt, a uniform that marked her current station in life, but could not hide the natural elegance of her posture. She moved with a quiet grace, wiping down the counter with a rhythmic, hypnotic motion, her mind drifting to places she dared not speak of aloud. She was the picture of resilience, a woman who had built a fortress around her heart, brick by brick, to survive a past that still haunted her nightmares. The diner was empty save for one patron, Old Man Earl, a fixture of the establishment whose weathered face was a roadmap of a hard life lived with integrity. He nursed a mug of black coffee, his eyes crinkling as he watched the snow pile up against the glass. "Storm's got teeth tonight, Layla," Earl murmured, his voice a gravelly rumble that broke the heavy silence. "Don't think anyone's going to be passing through till morning." "Might as well lock up." Layla looked up, offering him a soft, weary smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You know I can't do that, Earl. The owner wants the lights on until midnight, storm or no storm. Besides," she added, her voice dropping to a whisper as she looked out into the swirling white void, "the noise of the wind helps me think, but in truth, Layla didn't want to think." Thinking led to remembering, and remembering led to the pain of a life she had fled, a life of prestige, betrayal, and a man whose charm masked a cruel, manipulative heart. She was hiding here, in this snow globe of a town, hoping the world had forgotten her. But as the lights flickered overhead, casting long, dancing shadows across the checkered floor, the universe decided it was time to find her. The inciting incident arrived not with a bang, but with the menacing purr of engines that shouldn't have been able to survive such treacherous roads. High beams cut through the blinding snow, illuminating the interior of the diner like a sudden lightning strike. Layla froze, the rag in her hand hovering over a coffee stain, her heart skipping a beat. It wasn't the police, and it certainly wasn't a local truck. Earl shifted in his booth, his instincts flaring as he peered out the window, wiping the condensation away with a calloused hand. "Those ain't from around here," he muttered, his tone shifting from casual to cautious. The door to the diner burst open, bringing with it a gust of freezing wind and a flurry of snowflakes that danced across the floor before melting into dark puddles. 3 men stepped inside, shaking off the cold with an air of annoyance and entitlement. They were dressed in immaculate, expensive suits that were woefully inadequate for the weather, their shoes polished to a mirror shine that was now marred by slush. The man in the center, clearly the leader, was striking. He was tall, with sharp, angular features and cold, calculating eyes that swept the room, assessing threats in a single heartbeat. This was Junho, a man whose name was whispered in fear in the boardrooms and back alleys of Seoul, a powerful figure in the Korean underworld who was currently very far from home and very unhappy about it. Flanking him were 2 henchmen, distinct in their demeanor but identical in their dangerous aura. To his left was Kenji, stocky and restless, his hand hovering near the inside of his jacket. To his right was Dae-soo, silent and observant, watching Earl with the intensity of a hawk spotting a field mouse. The atmosphere in the diner shifted instantly, the cozy warmth replaced by a sharp, metallic tension. Layla felt a shiver run down her spine, not from the cold, but from the palpable power radiating from the central figure. He didn't look like a customer. He looked like a king who had stumbled into a peasant's hovel and was deciding whether to burn it down or buy it. Yet, despite the fear that pricked at her skin, Layla's training, both as a waitress and from her former life, kicked in. She straightened her spine, smoothing her red apron, and stepped out from behind the counter. She was the underestimated heroine, the woman who had seen monsters before and lived to tell the tale. She would not cower. "Welcome to the Rusty Spoon," she said, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the tension. "Table or booth?" Junho looked at her, really looked at her, and for a second, his mask of arrogance slipped, replaced by a flicker of surprise. He was used to people trembling. He was used to fear. He was not used to a waitress in a roadside diner meeting his gaze with the dignity of a queen. The trio moved to the largest booth in the back, the leather creaking as they sat, their presence dominating the small space. Layla grabbed 3 menus and a pot of fresh coffee, approaching them with a calm she didn't entirely feel. As she poured the steaming dark liquid into the thick ceramic mugs, she could feel Kenji's eyes boring into her, assessing her as a potential threat or perhaps just an object of amusement. "We didn't order yet," Kenji snapped, his English heavily accented and laced with irritation. He swatted his hand as if to shoo her away, a gesture of disrespect that made Earl's knuckles turn white around his own mug across the room. Layla didn't flinch. She didn't apologize. She simply finished pouring the coffee for Dae-soo and then turned her gaze to Junho. "You look cold," she said simply, her voice devoid of the subservience they expected. "And in this weather, coffee isn't an order. It's survival." On the house, Junho stared at the steaming mug in front of him, the vapor curling up to touch his face. He looked up at Layla, his dark eyes narrowing slightly. He was a man who believed that everything had a price, that kindness was a transaction, and that generosity was a trap. "Nothing is free," Junho said, his voice smooth and deep, carrying the weight of command. "What do you want?" Layla paused, clutching the coffee pot with both hands, the heat seeping into her palms. "I want you to warm up so you don't freeze to death when you go back out there," she replied, her tone matter-of-fact. "And I want you to be polite to the staff." That's the price. The silence that followed was deafening. Kenji looked ready to leap across the table, his face flushing with anger at the perceived insult to his boss. Dae-soo remained impassive, though his eyebrows twitched upward. Junho, however, did something unexpected. The corner of his mouth lifted in a microscopic smirk. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a sleek, platinum money clip, and peeled off a $100 bill, slamming it onto the table. "For the coffee," he stated, challenging her. Layla looked at the money, then back at him. She didn't take it. "Coffee is $2, sir." "I don't have change for that." She turned on her heel and walked back to the counter, leaving the money untouched and the most dangerous man in the room baffled. From his corner, Earl chuckled softly, shaking his head. "She ain't a sheep, son," the old man mumbled to himself, loud enough for the wind to carry the sentiment. "You best remember that." The storm outside intensified, transforming from a heavy snowfall into a full-blown blizzard. The wind battered the glass panes, rattling the frames with a violence that suggested the world was trying to break in. Inside, the dynamic had shifted into a strange, suspended reality. The roads were officially impassable. The local radio station, crackling with static, announced that all highways were closed. Junho and his men were stuck. For a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his environment, being at the mercy of the weather was infuriating, yet the forced proximity to the enigmatic waitress was becoming increasingly intriguing. Over the next hour, the barriers began to erode, worn down by the smell of frying bacon and the undeniable warmth of the diner. Layla moved between the kitchen and the dining area, bringing plates of comfort food, fluffy pancakes, crispy hash browns, and eggs, that she had prepared without them asking. She placed a plate in front of Junho, who had been aggressively typing on his phone, trying to manage an empire from a dead zone. "Eat," she commanded gently. "You can't conquer the world on an empty stomach." Junho set his phone down, looking at the humble meal. It was a stark contrast to the Michelin star dinners he was accustomed to, yet the smell evoked a buried memory of a simpler time, perhaps before the weight of his family's legacy crushed his innocence. He took a bite, and the taste was honest, warm, and grounding. "Why are you here?" Junho asked suddenly, his guard lowering just an inch. "You possess intelligence. Poise. You do not belong in a place like this." Layla paused, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked out the window at the swirling white darkness. "We all belong where we find peace." Layla's words hung in the air, suspended like the dust motes dancing in the dim light of the diner, carrying a weight that settled deep within Junho's chest. "We all belong where we find peace," she had said, and for a man who commanded armies of enforcers and navigated the treacherous currents of the criminal underworld, peace was a foreign concept, a luxury far more expensive than the Italian silk of his suit or the armored plating of his vehicles. The hours ticked by, the storm outside raging with a ferocity that made the diner feel like a life raft adrift in a white ocean, yet inside, a strange and fragile intimacy began to bloom. The other two men, Kenji and Daesu, had succumbed to the exhaustion of the road, their heads resting on their folded arms at a nearby booth, their soft snores providing a rhythmic counterpoint to the howling wind. This left Junho and Layla alone in the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the soft crackle of the old radiator. She moved to refill his coffee, her movements less guarded now, and he watched her hands that were rough from work but gentle in their touch. He noticed the absence of jewelry, the lack of pretense, and the quiet strength that radiated from her like heat from a hearth. He found himself speaking, his voice low and devoid of its usual sharp edge, sharing fragments of a life he rarely acknowledged, the pressure of a legacy he didn't choose, the isolation of power, and the constant, gnawing suspicion that everyone around him wore a mask. Layla listened, really listened, not interrupting with platitudes or awe, but offering simple, grounded wisdom that cut through his cynicism. She told him about the beauty of a sunrise over the highway when the world was still asleep, the satisfaction of a job done well, and the freedom of having nothing to lose. In that small, grease-stained diner, the billionaire Mafia boss and the runaway waitress found a common language in their shared loneliness, building a bridge across the vast chasm of their social standing. It was a slow-burn connection, sparking in the glances held a second too long and the comfortable silences that stretched between them, a realization dawning on Junho that this woman, with her red apron and weary smile, possessed a nobility that outshone every debutante and heiress he had ever known. The night eventually surrendered to the inevitable creep of dawn, the storm exhausting itself until the wind died down to a whisper and the heavy clouds began to break, revealing a sky of bruised purple and pale gold. The world outside was transformed, buried under feet of pristine, untouched snow that sparkled like a field of diamonds under the rising sun. Inside the diner, the spell of the night before was broken by the harsh reality of the morning. Kenji and Daesu were awake, stretching their stiff limbs and immediately reverting to their roles as vigilant protectors, checking their phones which now buzzed with a flood of delayed messages. Layla was back behind the counter, the fatigue evident in the dark circles under her eyes, but her spirit remained unbroken as she started the breakfast grill, the smell of sizzling bacon once again filling the air. However, the tranquility of the morning was shattered not by the roar of snowplows, but by the aggressive crunch of tires on the icy parking lot. A single vehicle, a flashy, cherry-red sports car that had no business being on these roads, skidded to a halt next to Junho's snow-covered transport. The door swung open, and out stepped a man who stood in stark contrast to the quiet dignity of the diner's occupants. It was Julian, the ghost from Layla's past, the reason she had fled her old life and buried her identity in this small town. He was handsome in a slick, manufactured way, dressed in a designer coat that cost more than the diner made in a year, his face twisted in a sneer of entitlement. He didn't knock. He shoved the door open, the bell jingling frantically as he strode in, bringing a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. Layla froze, the spatula slipping from her hand and clattering onto the grill, her breath hitching in her throat as the nightmare she had outrun finally caught up to her. Julian's eyes locked onto her, gleaming with a predatory triumph. "Found you," he hissed, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "Did you really think you could hide from me in this dump, Layla? Or should I call you by your real name?" The air in the diner turned instantly volatile, the romantic tension of the night replaced by a sharp, jagged fear. Julian ignored the three men sitting in the back booth, dismissing them as insignificant locals or stranded travelers, his focus entirely on the woman he considered his property. He marched up to the counter, his presence filling the space with a suffocating arrogance. "Pack your things," he commanded, slamming his hand down on the formica surface. "You're coming back with me. The little game of playing poor is over. You embarrassed me, leaving like that." No one leaves me. Layla backed away, her hands trembling, but her eyes flashed with a defiance that surprised him. I'm not going anywhere with you, Julian, she said, her voice shaking but firm. I built a life here. A real life. You don't own me, Julian laughed, a cruel, barking sound that grated on the nerves. A life? Serving slop to truck drivers? Look at you. You're pathetic. You're nothing without me. He reached over the counter, grabbing her wrist with a bruising grip, trying to drag her toward the exit. You're coming, and you're going to learn your place. Before Layla could struggle, a shadow fell over them. It wasn't Old Man Earl, who had risen from his seat with a protective growl, but Junho. He had moved with the silent, deadly grace of a predator, appearing at Julian's elbow before the other man even registered the movement. Junho didn't shout. He didn't make a scene. He simply reached out and placed a hand on Julian's shoulder, a grip that looked casual but was undoubtedly crushing, given the way Julian's face instantly drained of color. I believe the lady said she isn't going anywhere, Junho said, his voice calm, terrifyingly level, and laced with an authority that brooked no argument. Julian spun around, trying to wrench his shoulder free, his eyes widening as he took in the sharp suit, the cold stare, and the two henchmen who had silently risen behind Junho, their jackets unbuttoned just enough to suggest concealed weaponry. Who do you think you are? Julian spat, trying to salvage his bravado. This is a private matter. Get lost, or I'll buy this place and bulldoze it with you inside. The dramatic irony was palpable. Julian, a man of moderate wealth and massive ego, was threatening a man whose pocket change could buy Julian's entire bloodline. Junho stared at Julian with a kind of bored indifference a lion might show a buzzing fly, his expression unreadable yet terrifying. You speak of buying things, Junho murmured, stepping closer, forcing Julian to retreat a step. But you do not understand the value of anything. You see a waitress, I see a queen. You see a dump, I see a sanctuary. And you, he paused, his eyes narrowing into slits of obsidian ice. I see a mistake that needs to be corrected, Julian faltered, sensing the shift in the room, the realization dawning on him that he had stepped into a jagged trap. You don't know who I am, Julian stammered, his voice rising in pitch. Junho didn't answer. He simply snapped his fingers. The sound was crisp, echoing through the silent diner. Immediately, Kenji pulled out a phone and spoke a single, sharp phrase in Korean. The effect was instantaneous. From the distance, a low rumble began to vibrate through the floorboards, growing louder and deeper until it sounded like an approaching earthquake. The sound of engines, many, many engines, filled the air, drowning out the wind, the hum of the refrigerator, and Julian's sputtering protests. Everyone turned to the windows as the morning sun glinted off metal. They came from both directions of the highway, a sleek, black river of steel flowing against the white snow. It wasn't just a few cars. It was a procession. Black SUVs, armored sedans, luxury sports cars, an endless line of high-end machinery that surrounded the diner, blocking the exits, filling the parking lot, and lining the road as far as the eye could see. There were 135 of them, the full might of Junho's convoy that had been fighting through the blizzard all night to reach their leader. The sheer scale of the display was breathtaking, a physical manifestation of absolute power. Men in dark suits poured out of the vehicles, forming a perimeter, their expressions stoic and professional. Julian looked out the window, his jaw dropping, his arrogance evaporating into sheer terror as he realized the magnitude of the force he had just insulted. He turned back to Junho, shrinking under the weight of his own insignificance. I didn't, Julian choked out. Junho gestured to the door. Leave. Before I decide that the snow needs another body to bury, Julian didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled backward, tripping over his own feet, and fled the diner, his cherry-red sports car looking like a toy as he peeled out of the lot, desperate to escape the titan he had provoked. The silence that returned to the diner was heavy, but it was no longer fearful. It was filled with awe. Layla stood behind the counter, staring at the wall of black cars and the army of men standing guard outside, her mind struggling to comprehend that this was all for her, or rather, that the man who commanded it all was standing in her diner, drinking her coffee. Junho turned to her, the cold mask of the Mafia boss melting away to reveal the man underneath, the man she had connected with during the storm. He looked vulnerable for the first time, unsure of how she would react to the revelation of his true nature. "I apologize for the disturbance," he said softly, adjusting his cuffs. "My associates. They worry when I am out of contact." He walked over to the counter, placing a hand on the cool surface, looking into her eyes. "Layla, I have spent my life surrounded by people who want something from me. Last night, you gave me everything: warmth, safety, truth, and asked for nothing. You saved me. In more ways than one." He reached into his jacket, not for money this time, but to pull out a card with a simple, embossed number. "This place. It is too small for your spirit, but I will not force you to leave. That is not my way." He slid the card across the counter. "However, if you ever wish to see what lies beyond the snow, if you wish to build a life where you are the architect and not the refugee, call me." He signaled to Kenji and Daesu, and they moved toward the door. Old Man Earl, who had watched the entire spectacle with a wide grin, tipped his hat. "You're a good man, son," Earl said. "Complicated, but good." Junho nodded to the elder, then turned back to Layla one last time. "The coffee," he said with a faint smile, "was priceless." With that, he walked out into the cold, surrounded by his legion of 135 cars, leaving Layla with a beating heart and a choice. As the convoy rolled out, clearing a path through the snow, Layla looked at the card, then at the open road. The storm had passed, but the real change was just beginning, the silence left in the wake of the convoy ringing louder than the engines ever had. Layla stood frozen in the doorway of the Rusty Spoon, the freezing air nipping at her exposed skin, but she felt a strange, burning warmth in her chest that defied the winter chill. The heavy black card in her hand felt weightier than paper. It felt like a key to a door she had locked long ago and thrown away the key to. Inside the diner, the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. The mundane clatter of dishes and the hum of the refrigerator, sounds that had once defined the boundaries of her safe, small world, now seemed distant, like echoes from a life she had already outgrown. Old Man Earl, the only witness to the transformation that had just occurred, slowly sipped the last of his coffee, his eyes twinkling with a mixture of pride and sadness. He knew, just as Layla did, that the diner could no longer contain her. She turned back inside, the bell above the door jingling with a sound that felt like a goodbye. "He treated you like a queen when you were wearing an apron, Layla," Earl said softly, his voice cutting through her swirling thoughts. "Most men wait until you're in a gown to show you respect. That one?" He saw the royalty in the service. Layla looked at the old man, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. She realized that for years, she had been confusing safety with hiding. She had made herself small to avoid being a target, dimming her lights so it wouldn't attract the moths that bite. But Junho hadn't asked her to shine. He had simply recognized that she already was. The fear of Julian, which had dictated her every move for so long, had evaporated the moment Junho stood between them. It wasn't just because Junho was powerful. It was because he had validated her worth in a way that made Julian's petty cruelty seem insignificant. She looked around the diner, the cracked vinyl seats, the scuffed linoleum, the menu she knew by heart. It had been a sanctuary, a fortress against the storm, but fortresses are for war, and the war was over. It was time to build a home. Layla untied her red apron, the knot slipping loose with a sense of finality. She folded it neatly on the counter, right next to the empty coffee cup Junho had used. She wasn't leaving for the money. She wasn't leaving for the luxury cars or the promise of ease. She was leaving because for the first time in forever, she wasn't running away from something. She was running toward something. She was running toward a horizon where she didn't have to apologize for her strength, where her past was a chapter, not the whole book. 6 months later, the view from the floor-to-ceiling windows of a penthouse suite in Seoul was a galaxy away from the snow-covered plains of the American Midwest. The city sprawled out below like a circuit board of living light, a vibrant, pulsing testament to human ambition. Layla stood by the glass, her reflection ghosting over the cityscape. She was no longer wearing the white shirt and black skirt of a waitress. She was dressed in a tailored silk blouse and trousers that spoke of understated power, her hair styled in a way that framed her face with confidence. But her eyes were the same, deep, kind, and observant. She wasn't just a guest in this world. She was an active participant. In the months since she had made that call, she hadn't just become Junho's partner in romance. She had become his partner in life. She used her sharp intelligence and her innate understanding of people to help him navigate the treacherous waters of his business, softening his edges and reminding him that true power comes from lifting others up, not keeping them down. She had started a foundation for women escaping domestic abuse, using the vast resources now at her disposal to be the shield for others that Junho had been for her. The door to the study opened, and Junho entered. He looked different too, less guarded, the perpetual furrow in his brow smoothed out by months of genuine happiness. He walked over to her, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder as they both looked out at the city they now ruled together, not with an iron fist, but with a new philosophy of stewardship. "Do you miss the quiet?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that vibrated against her back. Layla smiled, placing her hand over his. "The quiet was necessary," she replied, turning in his arms to face him. "It was where I healed. But this—" She gestured to the lights, to the life they were building, to the man standing before her who looked at her with absolute adoration. "This is where I live." They had come from two different worlds, a waitress hiding in the snow and a mafia boss drowning in darkness. But they had found their way to each other through the simple, honest act of sharing a cup of coffee during a storm. It was a reminder that no matter how cold the winter gets, or how deep the snow piles up, spring is always waiting for those brave enough to weather the storm. Layla leaned up and kissed him, a promise of 1,000 tomorrows, proving that while 135 luxury cars might turn heads, it was the kindness of strangers and the courage of the heart that truly changed the world. And as they stood there, high above the city, the snow began to fall outside, soft and gentle, no longer a threat, but a beautiful reminder of the night their lives began.